In 1984, a band by the name of Houdini released a hit song, The Freaks Come Out at Night, wherein they detailed the dangers of the crimes that happen in the dark via an epic 80s rap. It's because I believe that nighttime is a uniquely dangerous time and that teenagers don't always make wise decisions that I affirm the resolution parents should impose curfews on their teenage children. Now, before we get into why I think this is true, it's important that we analyze the resolution in this debate round a little bit. First of all, this is just a general policy resolution, meaning that we're saying that generally speaking, it's wise for parents to impose curfews on their children. We're not saying that all kids should have the exact same curfews or that there shouldn't be exceptions, but that on balance, curfews are a good idea. The definition of a curfew is defined as a regulation requiring people to remain indoors between specified hours, typically at night. And I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Finally, I want to offer a standard for this debate round for how we determine which side wins. And that standard is parental responsibility. Now, we can probably both agree that parents have both a legal and a moral obligation to take care of their children. So it's my stance that if a curfew protects children, and if not having a curfew potentially harms them, then I should actually win the debate round. Now, there's going to be one contention that I'm going to offer in this debate round. We could focus on a number of aspects about why curfews are good, including the need for sleep and education and how it's good for habit forming. But I'm going to be focusing on what I think is most impactful, and that's safety. There's two areas that I think curfews protect children from. The first one is auto accidents. Data from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration found that the most dangerous times to drive on the road in the United States were between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m., where you're 5 times more likely to be in a deadly accident during these times, mainly because of drunk driving. Now, whether your kid is one of the ones doing the drunk driving or is just a victim of someone else's poor decisions, it's much safer to not have them on the road unnecessarily. Specifically, a study conducted in several states that found where local law enforcement enforced curfews, when done in cooperation with parents, found that auto accidents involving teens were reduced by 69%, 62%, and 40% in those states. Additionally, another study found that children whose parents enforced curfews on them were 6 times less likely to be in a fatal auto accident. The second area I want to talk about is crime exposure. The Journal of Police and Science Administration found in a coordinated study that when parents imposed curfews on their children, they significantly decreased the amount of juvenile crime and overall crime in that region. Penn State University documented that in Dallas and New Orleans specifically, when they instituted a curfew across the board, juvenile crime fell by 31%, specifically in the area of gang violence. Without curfews, children are more open to be exposed to crime, whether it's underage drinking, illicit drugs, gang violence, or vandalism. Even if your kid is a good one, they're still susceptible to being the victim of a crime at nighttime, and at nighttime, they're significantly more likely to be a victim of sexual assault, abduction, or gang violence. Curfews cost the children and parents nothing. It doesn't harm your children to not be out between 2 and 5 a.m., but we shouldn't leave them alone and have free reign.
Okay, so I'm going to address a few of my own points, and then I'll get to my opponent's points. So just a little bit of background of where I'm coming from and how I arrived at my position on this topic. I've worked with teenagers for over 10 years in the capacity of being a public school teacher, a teacher and tutor now, and the leader of an after-school program, teenagers between the ages of 14 and 17 specifically. So this is, I have kind of a lot of experience working with teens of this age group and seeing how the parenting works kind of in an up-close situation. And what I found to be true is that that opening line of Anna Karenina, that all happy families are the same, definitely holds true in that all happy families, or where the teenagers are thriving, they practice a style of parenting that is often called in parenting circles respectful parenting. I can provide lots of sites for this, but I'm just going to call it that for this debate for sake of time. And that's a respectful parenting is one that focuses on the relationship and communication with the child, as opposed to authoritarian rules-based parenting, which focuses on getting kids to obey often arbitrary rules. Curfews are an authoritarian view of parenting. And that style of parenting is shown widely in many different arenas and studies not to work, because the kids are afraid of getting in trouble rather than actually dangerous things, because by the time they're teenagers, they haven't been encouraged or allowed to develop real-world decision-making skills in the context of discussion or learning about the world. So for authoritarian parented kids, wrong equals getting caught. So here are my main contentions. First of all, curfews make teens prioritize the wrong thing, because if they're parented with this authoritarian parenting style, they'll prioritize being home on time rather than making safe decisions. And so I've observed this up close in many different situations where the teens engage in truly risky behaviors, like drunk driving themselves or driving home with a drunk driver, or in 2 different instances, being sexually assaulted because a young woman drove home with someone that she didn't know and wasn't comfortable with, but just had to make curfew. And that was the bigger priority rather than actual risky behaviors, driving home with a creepy guy, right? Okay, so second, what exactly are curfews supposed to teach or prevent? My opponent briefly touched on safety, but the studies that I was able to find by the National Institutes of Health, which is an amalgamation of all of the studies that he talked about in those specific studies, showed no causal relationship between city curfews and youth crime. So in some specific cities, some specific crimes were reduced, but there were enough other studies to show that it didn't have any other impact. There's also a very recent article from earlier in the summer by the Wall Street Journal, which is a conservative source, which shows the curfews to have really no measurable impact. I'd also like to go back to this idea of what are they supposed to prevent? So are they supposed to prevent crime? They're not shown to do that. Are they supposed to prevent drinking or sex? Or you can do all of those things during the day too. If you're a teenager, especially if your parents are at work, you're more likely to do those things during the day. I go to bed at like 9.
Okay, so really briefly addressing your last point that you mentioned about how kids can do all these illicit activities during the daytime. There's a couple different things we need to know on this point. You can see the argument that says more dangerous things happen at night, specifically with teenagers, because most of the time teenagers are occupied during the day with schoolwork or homework or other extracurricular activities. The opportunities for them to do those things are much more prevalent at night, which is why we see a lot more crime, specifically with juveniles, happening during the nighttime. So this idea that like, oh, well, it's going to happen during the day, therefore we shouldn't try to prevent it at the night, isn't really an impactful one. And it's disproven by the fact that more crime happens at night because it's more of an opportunity. Now, there's a couple arguments you hit on that I want to address. The first one is this notion of respectful parenting. And to be clear, I absolutely agree with you that we should have parenting that focuses on the relationship. That said, I don't think that that you can just scrap this idea that all rules that parents impose are inherently bad because they're authoritarian. Like, if you want to adopt this position, then I'm going to hold you to this position in the debate round that all rules are just generically bad. It's not a good argument to say that rules are bad because they're authoritarian, because this is an infinitely regressive position. In other words, what you need to show is you need to show how rules in this particular situation are uniquely bad. Like, we will probably both agree that it's really stupid to allow, your 6-year-old to go play in the street. Like, yeah, it's going to teach them responsibility, and yeah, it's going to teach them safety. But like, if I'm going to hold you to that position, then I'm going to take it to its logical conclusion and say that, well, more freedom is inherently good, therefore all rules are bad and authoritarian. I don't think you're that silly. I think you probably do support this idea of rules. So rather than taking this position that all rules are bad because they're all authoritarian, please clarify for me if you mean that all rules are bad. And if not, then show me why curfews uniquely violate the relationship between the child and the parent, and why curfews are actually bad. Rather, my response to this is that these are not mutually exclusive methods of parenting. My parents specifically did focus on the relationship. They used a respectful parenting practice. They did all those, all the meetings where they talked about how authoritarian parenting was bad. Yet I still had rules that I had to follow when I was living in their home. So this idea that you can only have one or the other, that you can only have a relational, respectful parenting method and not have any sort of rules is ridiculous. Show me how curfew rules are uniquely bad, and how they actually don't protect the kids in the way that I've administrated or showed in this debate round. The second argument you have is you offer some studies that show that city and youth curfews don't curtail crime. There's a couple different responses that I have to this. The first one is that we're not talking about state-mandated curfews. We can have an argument about whether or not city governments are effective at enforcing curfews. They probably usually aren't that effective, but I specifically cited 2 studies that showed that parents who enforce curfews, not the state, actually have success at curtailing crime and preventing kids from being in car accidents. So those 2 arguments you haven't addressed, and for that reason, I think I'm still winning.
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, I'd like to see the sites for those studies, because I don't really know how they would actually study like if you're being a survey, like an individual parent, like do you have a curfew? What would be the control group for children that are involved in crime, like that don't have a curfew? It seems like kind of impossible to quantify. So I'd like to see the methodology for that. So that's first of all. So second of all, this idea that the night is a uniquely dangerous time, that's not actually supported by data. And if you want to say that more crimes happen at night, those aren't crimes where teens are the victims, and those aren't crimes where teens are the perpetrators. So it's probably true that maybe more crimes do happen at night, because it's dark and someone can mug you or someone can come and rob your house, or most sexual assault probably happen at night as well. But the perpetrators of those crimes, unless you can show that the majority of those perpetrators and or victims are teens, which I don't think you've been able to show, I don't think that that's not supported by data. Also, there's this idea that rules are uniquely bad, but what I've said before is this idea that that rules, specifically a curfew, make the teen specifically focus on the curfew rather than actual bad decisions that they could avoid making, or they could practice making good decisions. So what I'd like to ask you is, what does a curfew accomplish that a relationship can't? So what's more valuable? So you could say to your teenage daughter, like, oh, it's Sally's birthday tonight. You're going to the roller rink? Awesome. What did you get her for her birthday? Like, that's so great. What time do you think you'll be home? Like a real relationship that respects that person, as opposed to be home by 11 as you walk out the door. The former is obviously much more respectful and much more likely to create a relationship, much more likely to create a thriving adult that somebody raises, rather than just the rules-based one. And so I think that means that the resolution doesn't stand, because there are many different ways to accomplish the goal of curfew, which is safety, according to you, which is your primary goal. The best way to keep your child safe is to teach your child how to make good decisions. And a curfew doesn't teach your child how to make good decisions. There are plenty of other ways that you can teach a teenager how to make decisions that's not a curfew. And so unless you can show that a curfew is the best way to teach good decision making, I really don't think that the resolution can stand. There's also this idea of, so I already addressed the idea of the uniquely dangerous time of night. I don't think that's supported by data. Most dangerous things don't happen at night. Many dangerous things do happen during the day, especially to teenagers. So if you can present any kind of evidence to the respect of teens engaging in these risky behaviors during the day, again, I'd also like to present that if your teenager is going to engage in those behaviors like drinking or having sex or drug use, that also is something that should be discussed, rather than something that should just be like, don't do it. And kind of hands-off authoritarian parenting style, right? The best way to create a healthy, thriving teen is to talk to them.
Okay, so we still haven't addressed this issue of, do you support the stance that all rules are inherently authoritarian? And if you do, then let me know. But if you don't, then show me how curfews uniquely are bad rules that are authoritarian. Because what I want you to do is, if you support some rules for parenting, show me the distinction between the rules that you support and the rules that you don't support. Your argument is this: curfews, curfews harm the relational aspect, because if it's, be home by 11, then that's bad parenting, because it doesn't actually teach the student, or the child, about the actual safety. My response is, these two ideologies are not mutually exclusive. You can have a rule that says you're required to be home at 11 and also explain to somebody why that is the case. So for example, and I'm just a case study just because I just am myself and I happen to have been a teenager before, I can tell you that my parents would establish rules for me and also explain to me why those rules were actually in place. The distinction is, so here's the two competing viewpoints. Under my viewpoint, you can have the rule and the relationship. Under your viewpoint, if you're saying all rules are bad, then all you're left with is this hope that the parent can just rationalize with a 13-year-old and tell them, oh, well, Timmy, it's bad for your health if you stay up all night at your friend's house. I'm not going to make you come home. So you have the option to stay out all night and play video games. I'm not going to make you come home because I value the relationship and not the rules. So you have these two competing viewpoints. Under my viewpoint, you can have a hard and fast rule that does actually help the relationship and is actually explained. Under your viewpoint, which is at this point in the debate round, a critique of all rules, you can't have both. You can only have the relationship. And here's the reality. Adults are more rational agents than children are. Like, teenagers are not mature human beings. And obviously at some level, we should parent them on a relational level and try to get them to understand. The reality is, though, they aren't perfect and they aren't adults. We can't just say, oh yeah, we can't just assume and hope that if we explain something to them, that they will always do it. That's why kids have laws that's why there are laws pertaining to minors exclusively that don't pertain to adults. That's why you can't drive before you're 16. That's why you can't drink alcohol before you're 21. So I want you to justify this position for me. Tell me if you're against all rules, and if not, then why are curfews uniquely bad rules? Additionally, you haven't addressed my response, which was that these two types of parenting are not mutually exclusive. You can have the relationship and the explanation while also having the rule. Here's the other argument that is very, very important with the responsibility. Look, if you want to teach your children responsibility, teach them responsibility in areas that couldn't cost them their life. I've already explained to you, like if you're out past certain times, you're at an increased likelihood of being in a fatal car accident, and you haven't addressed that issue. Additionally, I've talked about how more crimes happen to teenagers, and I did give a study, and I'll post it if you want, at night. So if you want to teach them responsibility, teach it in an area that doesn't cost them their life.
Okay, so I did address your point of why curfews are uniquely authoritarian, and it's because they force kids to focus on the rule rather than focus on the outcome of just being home by curfew. So what the kid, in an authoritarian style of parenting, the child will be more focused on getting in trouble, or, oh, my parents are going to ground me if I'm not home by midnight, as opposed to engaging in a risky behavior in order to make that curfew, which I've seen happen time and time again, and happens so frequently because, as you said, teenagers need to be guided through their decisions. And so this debate isn't about teens should be able to do whatever they want. This debate is parents should impose curfews on their teenage children. And what you haven't answered on what I've asked before is, what does a curfew accomplish that a relationship wouldn't? Because a relationship accomplishes all of these other things, keeping the child safe, allowing the child to make good decisions for themselves, practice good decision making. Whereas a curfew is something that, according to your own definition, is be home by a certain amount of time. So with a curfew, that is just giving your child blanket kind of, as long as you're home by this time, everything's okay. And that's the implication for actual teenagers in the real world. Whereas if you actually talk with the person and say, you know, in a respectful manner, like sometimes it's appropriate to say, hey, so you'll be home by 6 o'clock? Okay, well, I'll expect you then. The way that you would have a house guest or your boyfriend or girlfriend, you know, like, oh, you're going to this bar? Well, probably you'll be home by what time? Okay, well, then I'll know that if you're not home by that time, maybe I should call you and see if you're okay. That's just respectful, I think. Sometimes it's appropriate to be home at noon if you're doing something in the day. Sometimes it's appropriate to be able to call your parents and say, hey, I really don't feel comfortable driving home right now. Can you come pick me up? And in my experience with teenagers, working with them over the years, parents, when they have an authoritarian parenting style, like just the rules-based parenting, they don't feel comfortable calling their parents for that. Also, you're presuming that all teenagers are going to be going somewhere where they're driving, which in the town that I live in and in the town that I'm in right now, that's definitely not the case. So there are plenty of places where when teenagers go somewhere, they walk or they take public transportation. And I don't know like specific statistics on this, but I would say that probably in the majority of the world, definitely in the majority of places in my city, that's what they're doing. In all of those things, curfews are uniquely bad because they make teens focus on the rules and not the decision-making process. And relationship parenting doesn't mean that teens can do whatever they want. Relationship parenting means that the parent and the teenager talk about the background behind the decision-making and then make a decision mutually together based on that. And if you've done relationship parenting kind of all through, and I've seen how it really works, it's actually awesome that I can have this job and view it. It really does work.
Okay, look, parents and teenagers can talk about the background about why curfews exist and why they're a good thing, and also have a curfew simultaneously. So again, you failed to show me why curfews uniquely make it impossible for relational parenting to happen. Now, what you said is, well, I did answer it. And you said it's unique because it forces kids to focus on the rule. That's a direct quote. My response is, my question to you is this: what rule does not require the student to be focused, or the child to be focused on the rule? Like, yes, that's the point of a rule. If you aren't focusing on the rule and you aren't following it, then of course it's a poor rule. So my question to you was, what makes curfews unique as rules as opposed to other rules? And your response was, it forces kids to focus on the rules. So show me, give me examples of rules that you support that and why you support them, and then show me why curfews do not meet those criteria. Because what I'm still getting this generic, oh, well, curfews are authoritarian and we need to have relational parenting, when you and I both know that it's wise for parents to have rules in place. And that relational parenting and respectful parenting, as you referred to it, does require rules to exist and rules to be in place. So my question is, again, show me a unique reason for why curfews violate that ability for the parent to explain why the rule exists and for the kid to understand it. The next argument was you asked the question, what can a relationship or respectful parenting method accomplish that a rule can't? Couple things. First of all, it doesn't establish boundaries. A relational parent can say, oh yeah, I'm just going to trust you to make your own decision, and I'm going to try to give you life advice. But ultimately, I'm not going to be that worried when you show up at 5 a.m. Or I'm going to let you stay out as late as you want. So here's the difference. And it goes back to my other point about how teenagers are not rational agents comparatively to adults. Teenagers do not make smart decisions. They make stupid decisions. You're living in, the method you're promoting is living in a fantasy land where all teenagers make smart decisions and constantly make the same wise decisions that parents would. You're arguing, well, if you just have a good relationship with your parent, and then your teenager is never going to need any rules because they're just going to be smart enough to know that there's nothing bad. Again, tell me if you support all rules and what rules are good. Parents and teenagers can talk about the background and can still have relational parenting while also maintaining curfews rules. Here's the bigger impact. There's no cost to imposing a curfew rule. However, there are great costs to potentially having your child die in a car accident or being exposed to a crime or being a victim of a crime. And we haven't spent that much time talking about all my evidence because you haven't really addressed it. But I've proven that you're at a greater risk of being in a fatal car accident, you're at a greater risk of being exposed to crime, and you're at a greater risk of being a victim of crime the later you stay out if you are a teenager. So let's not teach them responsibility where drugs and violence and car accidents are on the line. Teach them responsibility in other areas first.
Okay, so I just kind of want to clarify, because I think it's getting lost, this idea that the difference between relational parenting and curfew. Okay, so you say that you can have both, but let me give you kind of a hypothetical example. Like, what if you lived with your significant other and the person was going out for drinks with their friends, and you said, oh, you're going to that place? Oh, okay, what time do you think you'll be home? Okay, midnight? Okay, cool. That is an example of the relational parenting style that I'm talking about, the way that you would relate with another adult, because teenagers are very close to being adults, and especially in the case of older teenagers, they're only maybe a year or so away from leaving the house and living like adults. So there's that. A curfew is something else. A curfew is if you told your partner, you need to be home by midnight, and you're going to be in trouble if you're not. That is something else. That's a rule. That's not an agreed upon being considerate to the people that you live with by telling them what time you're going to be home so that they can, worry about you or try to help you out or find you if you're not home by that time. There is a difference. And so it's not like you can have both. A curfew does harm the relationship with the child. And I would say that relational parenting is not based on, I would call that an authoritarian rule, because it's more about habits, and it's more about things being on a case-by-case basis and talking about things, just the way that you would with like another adult that you respected, like if you had a house guest or anything else. And I think that it would really surprise you. I mean, perhaps it surprises lots of people I know how truly responsible teenagers can really be when you trust them. I'll give one example of, I led an after-school group for 16 teenage girls. They were all between the ages of 14 and 15. We drove from San Diego to San Francisco. This is quite a while ago. I had a co-leader, and they walked around on Fisherman's Wharf, and I talked to a couple of them. I said, okay, well, what time do you guys think that you'll be ready to walk back, and what time should I expect you to meet back at the restaurant? They all talked with each other, and they decided that they would be back in about 2 or 3 hours. I'm like, okay, so everybody's going to be back then by 7 o'clock. That's cool. All of them, to a person, every single one of them was back before 7 o'clock. That's not a curfew. 7 o'clock wasn't a rule that was like house rule. They had to be back by that time. That was something that we talked about. That was something that we mutually agreed upon. That's the difference. So if you're trying to say that there can be both, I don't think that there can be both, because I think, and your definition says, that a curfew is a different thing. A curfew is something where it's a set rule, like this is the house rule. You have to be indoors by this time. At the case of Fisherman's Wharf, we weren't indoors. We agreed upon that right immediately before, and they decided to just go walk around. So those are completely different things. So this idea that like bad things happen at night, I'd really like to see the evidence that teenagers are either the perpetrators or the victims. And you haven't addressed my point of often teenagers do not drive. They walk or use public transport.
Okay, so I'll really hit those last 2 points. The first one was I actually referenced a specific study, and I'll be posting it if you want. But the study was, where is it? I'm looking for it. The study was from the Journal of Police and Science Administration, and they found that crime to teenagers specifically happened later in the evening. And I'll post it below at the end of the debate, but just to clarify that. The second point I wanted to clarify is addressing the answer that you just had about how some teens walk. Sure, this is really not an impactful answer or argument. Like, yes, in some towns, teens walk, they don't drive. Most teens who are 15 or 16 or older will be driving. Having a curfew protects them from the risk of driving. Your argument is only a mitigating one. It only says, well, not all teens are at risk of being in accidents. Therefore, it's not a problem to worry about. It's very clear that some teenagers are at risk of accidents, and you've conceded the argument that it's more dangerous for them to drive. So I'm winning on that argument. Look, here's what you haven't done. You've kind of here's what you have done. You've towed the line between saying we should not be authoritarian in our parenting policies, and we should have a relational method. And so my question for you is this. I made this in my opening speech. I said, if you're going to hold this relational parenting method, and you're going to say that all rules are bad, then I'm going to hold you to that standard. But you've kind of towed the line between saying all rules are bad and also wanting to hold on to the relational parenting method. And you haven't offered a distinction or a nuance between why curfew is a bad rule, but other rules are good rules. So my question is this. What's a rule for teenagers that you support that doesn't violate this quote unquote relational method?
Okay, so just to address a couple of last points. So the relational parenting hopefully I addressed this before, I thought I did, can address all of those other concerns about the safety. So as I said before, if a teenager is at a party, drunk, thinking, oh, maybe I should not drive, if they've been parented with an authoritarian parenting style, they're not going to call their parents and say, hey, can you call a car for me? Hey, can I wait for my friends to come and get me? They're just going to drive home because that's the style of parenting that's not relational. So all of these dangers that you've talked about, like the being on the road or the being at risk of sexual assault, all of those things can be mitigated by respectful, responsible parenting for teaching your children about real world consequences ahead of time. So if you know that your child is going somewhere far away, that they're going to have to drive, you can arrange to drive them there and then pick them up. Or you can say, know what time that they're going to be back. Say, oh, so will you call and check in with me at about 10:30 and see if you want to stay a little bit later? And then it's an ongoing. All of those safety concerns can be mitigated with respectful and responsible parenting, as I've seen happen countless times in the real world with actual teenagers. So there's that. You keep harping on this idea of safety, but the specific study that you state only has a few different cities, and there was an amalgamation of these different studies from the National Institutes of Health in 2014, and then a more recent one that's cited in the Wall Street Journal that says that there is no causal link between teen curfews, city-imposed teen curfews, and safety. So I would like to know the methodology for this police one. Like, how big is the control group? Or where is this taking place? I think it would be easier to pick it apart if that were the case. And you still haven't addressed this idea of what does a curfew accomplish that a relationship doesn't? If you have a good relationship, you don't need the curfew. So therefore the resolution fails because parents should impose curfews. Well, if you have this relationship with your child, which is the better way to go, and that's one of the reasons I was so interested in doing this debate, is because I found this style of parenting to be just amazing in all of the teenagers that I've worked with, in parents that I know. And I would really encourage everybody who has children or is even thinking about having them or is a child to learn a little bit more about it for those reasons. That is the best way to arm your child to be a thriving, good citizen. As Maria Montessori, the legendary educator, said, the best practice when you're thinking about kind of like a mission statement for raising your child is teach her to do it herself. And so if you can arm your child with that, if you can say, hey, I have your back if you need to call me, if you feel unsafe out there, but I want you to be able to make your own decisions of when you need to call, what's a smart behavior to engage in the world. That's ultimately going to raise better citizens, people that aren't just blindly obedient to authority, that use their critical thinking, that have good relationships with their families. And I think that that's one of the best things that we can hope for as a society.
As somebody who was homeschooled, I absolutely love that Montessori quote. And I do think that children should be taught the why and the how of things rather than just blindly following rules. But that said, I don't think that your stance of there are 0 rules that we should ever have as parents is a viable one. I don't think it holds water in this debate round, and I think it's ridiculous. Look, you still haven't answered my question. You haven't given me a single rule that you actually support, and you haven't told me if you support no rules and what rules you do support and how curfews are different from those rules. Like what you in your example about the teenager going out, you say, okay, what time are you going to be back? What if the teenager says, I'm going home. I'll be home after the rave party where I'm doing cocaine, and it should be around 5 a.m. The relational parenting method would say, okay, honey, that's probably not the best idea, but you should go and learn it for yourself. This is absolutely ridiculous. In this debate round, I've given you a ton of studies to support why it's actually dangerous. I've shown you that crime is more dangerous at night and teenagers are more at risk and how curfews are effective at stopping it. And I've shown you the driving angle. All you've given me is personal stories and personal examples of where you've seen a teenager be responsible. We've all seen teenagers be responsible in the moment. The question is, can you trust them to be responsible all of the time and not have any rules whatsoever? I think this is a horrible method of parenting, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. You can have rules